Just imagine being woken up at 3 in the morning by a whisper. Not just any whisper, but your own name. That's what happened to me. And the voice came from the baby monitor sitting on my nightstand. Now here's the part that made my blood run cold. My son wasn't home. He was spending the night at his grandparents' house across town, fast asleep in their guest room. His nursery here in my house. Empty. Silent. No reason at all for the monitor to be on. And yet, at exactly 3:02 a.m., I found myself wide awake, staring at the glowing green light, listening to a voice breathe through the static. Daniel. At first, I told myself it had to be interference. These monitors sometimes picked up truckers on the interstate or even a neighbor's baby crying through the walls. I'd heard faint voices before, fragments, half-words, never clear enough to make sense of. But this was different. It wasn't random noise. It wasn't clipped or distorted. It was deliberate, shaped, and meant for me. I froze, the sound still echoing in my head, and slowly reached for the dial to turn the volume up. My hand shook as if the very act of touching the plastic might somehow invite whatever was on the other end closer. The static swelled, filling the silence of the room like rushing water. For a long moment, it was just noise, and then, there it was again. Daniel. This time it was clearer, closer, almost intimate. I could hear the way the voice curled around the syllables, like someone leaning just past the microphone, whispering straight into my ear through that tiny speaker. And then it said something worse. Come here. My stomach dropped. It wasn't faint this time, it wasn't broken up. It was sharp, intentional, and direct. Like a command. Like someone was standing in my son's empty nursery right then, calling me down the hall. I sat there, motionless, my eyes locked on the monitor, my ears straining to catch the slightest hint of sound from the house. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to stretch into the silence. Every shadow at the edges of my vision seemed thicker, heavier. The monitor hissed once more, then fell quiet. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. That primal certainty that something was hiding in the dark, watching me. I couldn't shake it. My rational mind screamed at me that it was just interference, just a trick of electronics, but every instinct in my body whispered that I wasn't alone. I wanted to turn the device off, but my hand wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the bed, staring at that glowing green light, waiting for it to flicker again. And in those endless, dragging seconds of silence, one thought rose to the surface and lodged itself in my chest. How did it know my name? The question gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I tried to push it away, tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the truth kept circling back. The voice hadn't sounded like a stranger. It had sounded like someone who knew me. Finally, with my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, I forced myself to reach over and flick the switch. The monitor went dark. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I lay back in bed, clutching the blanket like a shield, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep wasn't an option anymore. My mind was alive, replaying those words again and again, like a recording on loop. Daniel, come here. I thought about calling my parents to check on my son, just to reassure myself he was safe. But the clock read 3:15 now, and the idea of waking them with some frantic story about voices on a baby monitor felt ridiculous. What would I even say? That a ghost had whispered my name through a piece of plastic and wire? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had spoken wasn't done with me. And as much as I wanted to pretend it was nothing, I had this horrible, gnawing certainty that tonight had only been the beginning. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds like nothing had happened. For a moment, lying there in the warmth, I almost believed it. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing in that hazy space between sleep and waking. But when I rolled over and saw the baby monitor on the nightstand, its black screen turned toward me like a dead eye, the memory came rushing back. Daniel, come here. I swallowed hard, reached for the device, and slipped it into the drawer. Out of sight, out of mind. By the time I showered, shaved, and grabbed coffee, I had almost convinced myself to let it go. My son would be home later that afternoon, cheerful and tired after a night with his grandparents, and the house would go back to normal. That's what I told myself. Normal. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered like a faint shadow. I kept expecting something to happen, another whisper, another flicker of sound, but the house was silent. Too silent. I left the TV on in the background just for the noise. When I finally drove across town to pick up my son, the sight of him running down the walkway toward me was enough to break the tension in my chest. He wrapped his arms around my waist, and for a while, I almost forgot. We drove home together, singing along to songs on the radio, his small voice filling the car. But the moment we walked through the front door, I felt it again. That heaviness, that awareness, like the house was holding its breath. My son darted upstairs to grab a toy, and I lingered in the kitchen, gripping the counter, forcing myself to breathe. The house creaked in its usual places, but it didn't sound the same. Every sound seemed amplified, deliberate, like the walls themselves were listening. When my son came running back, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur, I pasted on a smile. Ready for lunch? He nodded eagerly. As I fixed sandwiches, I caught him staring down the hallway toward his room. His expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he turned back to me. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated. "Nothing." But the way he said it didn't sound like nothing. We ate together at the table, his chatter about cartoons and video games bouncing through the room, but my eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. The nursery door was slightly ajar, though I could have sworn I'd left it closed. The monitor, tucked away in my drawer upstairs, felt like a weight pressing against my thoughts. After lunch, my son asked if he could play outside, and I agreed. I stood by the kitchen window, watching him chase the dog across the yard, laughing, carefree. That laugh was a relief. It meant he wasn't carrying the same dread I was. At least not yet. But when I glanced back at the hallway, my stomach dropped. The nursery door was wide open. I stared, frozen. No sound, no movement, just the open doorway yawning into darkness. Forcing myself to move, I walked down the hall, each step heavier than the last. My hand shook as I pushed the door the rest of the way open. The room was still. Toys in their bins, the crib neatly made. Nothing out of place. Nothing at all. And yet, standing there, I could feel it. That same presence from the night before. Watching. Waiting. I backed out of the room, closing the door firmly this time, and pressed my palm against the wood. Cold. Too cold. The rest of the afternoon blurred by in a haze of forced normalcy. I played with my son, watched TV with him, tucked him into bed that night, pretending everything was fine. Pretending I wasn't rattled. But when I checked on him before I went to sleep, I paused at his doorway. He was already out, breathing softly, clutching his dinosaur. And then he whispered. Not to me. Not awake. In his sleep, his lips moved around a word that turned my blood to ice. Daniel. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son's lips moving in his sleep, shaping my name like it belonged to someone else's mouth. He didn't even realize he'd said it. That's what scared me the most. By midnight, I gave up trying. I sat in the living room with the TV on low, nursing a mug of coffee, telling myself I was just tired, just paranoid. Kids mumble in their sleep all the time. It didn't mean anything. But I couldn't stop replaying the night before. The monitor, the whisper, the voice that had called me into an empty room. At 2:47 a.m., the house shifted. That's the only way I can describe it. One moment, it was quiet, humming with the ordinary stillness of night. The next, everything seemed to lean in, like the air had thickened, pressing against my skin. And then I heard it. A faint click, followed by the soft crackle of static. I froze, my eyes snapping toward the hallway. I knew exactly where it was coming from. The baby monitor. I turned it off. I'd shoved it into the drawer upstairs, away from sight. But now, even from the living room, I could hear it. Hisses. My mug rattled against the coffee table as I set it down. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me down the hall, up the stairs, toward my bedroom. The closer I got, the louder it became, the static filling the space like rushing water. When I reached the doorway, I saw it. The drawer was open. The monitor sat on top of the nightstand, its green light glowing faintly in the dark. I hadn't put it there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stepped closer, the floor creaking under my weight. The static hissed, then softened, then broke apart, like something on the other end was struggling to push through. And then I heard it. Daniel. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the doorframe. The voice was louder now, clear, almost urgent. Come here. My stomach clenched. The words were the same, but the tone had changed. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was closer, stronger, like it was no longer asking, it was demanding. The monitor hissed again, and for a split second, I heard something else layered beneath the voice. A sound I couldn't quite place. Breathing. Not mine. Not my son's. Something heavier. Slower. I wanted to smash the thing, to rip it out of the wall and throw it into the street. But before I could move, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around. The hallway was empty. My chest tightened as I stepped back, glancing from the monitor to the shadows stretching down the hall. The air felt colder now, thick enough to sting my throat. And then my son cried out. It wasn't a scream, just a sudden, sharp whimper from his room. The kind kids make when they're startled awake. I bolted down the hall, threw his door open. He was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, clutching his dinosaur to his chest. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why are you standing in my room?" I froze. I just got here," I stammered, stepping closer. "It's okay, buddy. It was just a dream." But he shook his head hard, pointing toward the corner by his closet. "No," he whispered. "You were there." The room was dark, but not dark enough to hide the empty corner. My eyes darted to the shadows, searching for movement, for anything. There was nothing. I sat on the edge of his bed, pulling him close. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "You're safe." But over his shoulder, I couldn't stop staring at that corner. The shadows seemed too deep, too heavy, as though something was crouched just beyond sight. And then, faintly, through the baby monitor still glowing on my nightstand down the hall, I heard it one last time. "Daniel." The next morning felt like a blur. I moved through the motions of making breakfast, packing a lunch for my son, checking my work emails, but everything felt slightly off, like I was going through the day inside someone else's skin. My son, though, seemed fine. Cheerful, humming to himself as he spooned cereal into his mouth, as though the night before hadn't happened at all. I wanted to ask him about it, about the corner, about why he thought he'd seen me standing there, but the words stuck in my throat. He was only 7. If I pressed him too hard, I'd either scare him or convince him it was real. And maybe that was the part one couldn't admit to myself yet. I was starting to believe it was real. The house felt different now. It's hard to explain unless you've lived somewhere long enough to know it intimately. The particular creaks of the floorboards, the groan of pipes at night, the hum of the fridge. My house used to sound familiar, comforting. But now, every sound carried a new weight. The quiet between them stretched too long, as though something in that silence was listening. I spent most of the day avoiding the upstairs. When I did have to go up, grabbing laundry, making the beds, I kept my eyes averted from the nursery door. I kept it firmly shut, but every time I passed it, I felt the weight of it pressing against me. Like something was on the other side, leaning its head close, waiting. By evening, I convinced myself I needed air. "Come on, buddy," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's go to the park." His face lit up. Within minutes, we were out the door, the crisp air of late September brushing against our skin. For the first time in days, I felt a little lighter. The sun slanted low, painting the sky with orange, and the sounds of other families at the park, children laughing, dogs barking, drowned out the silence I'd been carrying with me. But even there, in the open air, I couldn't shake it completely. I caught myself scanning the tree line, watching shadows move between the trunks as the sun dipped lower. Every time my son ran ahead of me, I felt the urge to call him back, to keep him close. It wasn't just parental instinct. It was something deeper, a gnawing certainty that distance between us was dangerous. That night, after he fell asleep on the couch, I carried him upstairs, careful not to wake him. I tucked him in, lingered at his bedside a moment longer than usual, and whispered, "I'm right here. You're safe." But as I straightened, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The baby monitor wasn't on the nightstand anymore. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone into my bedroom since the morning. But there it was again, this time sitting on the dresser, angled directly toward the bed where I slept. I stared at it for a long time, my breath shallow, my body frozen between fight and flight. The green light flickered once, as if something had brushed against the transmitter. I forced myself to walk over, unplug it, and shove it back into the drawer. My hands shook the whole time. That night, I lay awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The silence of the house stretched on, every minute heavier than the last. When the clock read 3 a.m., I felt it again, that shift in the air. The same one I'd felt before, thick and pressing, like the house itself was inhaling. But the monitor stayed silent. No static. No whispers. Nothing. And somehow, that silence was worse. Because lying there in the dark, my son asleep down the hall, I had the strangest, most chilling certainty. Whatever had whispered my name wasn't gone. It was waiting. The following day should have been ordinary. The kind of day where nothing happens, where life drifts by in a haze of errands, dishes, and laundry. But for me, it felt like walking on glass. Every corner of the house carried weight now. Shadows lingered a second too long. The air felt charged, humming beneath the surface like static waiting to break. I found myself jumping at the smallest things, the creak of a step, the groan of the heater turning on. More than once, I caught myself holding my breath, listening, waiting for that voice to return. But all day, the monitor stayed silent. By the time evening came, my nerves were stretched thin. I tucked my son into bed early, read him a story, and left the night light glowing softly in the corner. I lingered in his doorway longer than I should have, staring at his small frame curled beneath the blankets, afraid to leave him alone. Finally, I forced myself to step back into the hallway. And that's when I saw it. The nursery door was open again. I had closed it. I knew I had. My hand tightened on the doorknob to my son's room as I stared down the hall. The nursery yawned open, the darkness inside thick and impenetrable. I should have walked away. I should have shut myself in my bedroom and ignored it. But something about the open doorway drew me in, like a hook buried deep in my chest, pulling. My feet carried me down the hall before I even realized it. The air grew colder with each step. When I reached the nursery, I placed a trembling hand on the doorframe and peered inside. At first, everything looked normal. Toys neatly stacked, the crib untouched, curtains swaying slightly in the breeze from the cracked window. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something new. The baby monitor's transmitter, the part that belonged in this room, wasn't on the shelf where I'd left it weeks ago. It was in the crib, positioned dead center on the pillow, as though something invisible had carefully placed it there. I felt my chest tighten. A whisper of static buzzed faintly from the receiver upstairs in my room, the one I'd unplugged and shoved into the drawer. My knees went weak. That wasn't possible. And yet, the hiss was there, bleeding faintly into the silence, calling me back down the hall. I backed away from the nursery, my pulse thundering in my ears, and shut the door firmly behind me. My hand lingered on the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to lock it. Somehow, locking it felt dangerous, like it would provoke whatever had taken up space in my home. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hiss of the monitor seeping from the drawer. My thoughts spun in frantic circles. I could throw it out, burn it, smash it to pieces. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The monitor wasn't the source. It was just a window, and something on the other side wanted me to look through. At 3:13 a.m., I heard it again. Not the voice this time, something worse. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving down the hallway outside my room. I sat up, heart slamming against my ribs, straining to hear. The steps paused outside my son's door. The silence that followed was unbearable. I forced myself to move, to throw off the blanket, to grab the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, an old baseball bat leaning against the closet. My legs carried me to the hallway before I could think. The air was freezing. I stood between the two doors, my son's room to the left, the nursery to the right. Both closed, both silent. And then, faintly, from behind the nursery door, the monitor crackled. Daniel. The voice was clearer than ever, deeper, closer. This time, it didn't sound like a whisper. It sounded like something standing on the other side of the door. I didn't move. The voice had crawled out of the static and taken shape, thick and heavy, vibrating through the wood of the nursery door. For a few seconds, the house was so quiet I could hear my own pulse. I tightened my grip on the baseball bat until my knuckles ached. My son's room was only a few feet away. I wanted to rush in there, scoop him up, and get us both out of the house, but some terrible instinct rooted me in place. The voice spoke again. Daniel, open the door. I felt my throat close. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command. The knob of the nursery door shuddered against its frame, like someone on the other side had tried it. The faint metallic rattle froze me where I stood. No, I couldn't let it in. My hand shot to the light switch, flooding the hallway with a weak yellow glow. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Just silence. Then the nursery fell quiet. I stood there another full minute, barely breathing, waiting for the knob to move again. It didn't. Finally, I backed away, step by step, until I could push into my son's room. He was still asleep, his breathing soft and steady, untouched by the chaos in the hall. I set the bat down beside his bed and lowered myself into the chair by the window. That's where I stayed until the first gray light of morning seeped in. The day dragged like a blur. My body was heavy, my head aching from lack of sleep, but I forced myself through the motions, cereal, cartoons, picking up toys. My son never mentioned anything about the night before. He was his usual self, chattering about superheroes and dinosaurs. But I couldn't shake it. Every creak in the house felt like a warning. Every flicker of shadow made my skin crawl. I caught myself staring at the nursery door over and over again, waiting for it to swing open on its own. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been on the other side of that door, and it wanted me to let it in. By evening, the tension had worn me raw. I tried to distract myself. TV, music, even stepping outside for air, but nothing settled me. The house pressed against me like a weight, thick with silence. After I put my son to bed, I lingered in the hallway again, staring at the nursery. The door was shut, the brass knob catching the faint light. I almost expected it to turn, to twitch, to rattle like it had the night before. It didn't. I turned away, shut myself into my room, and locked the door. Sleep never came. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. At 3 a.m., the shift happened again. The air thickened. The silence grew louder, pressing into my ears until I could hear nothing else. Then, the monitor in my drawer crackled to life. I sat up, sweat breaking across my forehead, my eyes locked on the nightstand. The drawer rattled faintly, as if something inside wanted out. The static grew, louder, until it filled the room like a rising tide. And then, through the hiss, Daniel. But this time, there was more. A laugh. Low, broken, curling at the edges like rusted metal. It wasn't human. The drawer jolted, hard enough to rattle the lamp on top. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and for the first time since this started, I gave in to the fear. I grabbed the drawer's handle, yanked it open, and hurled the monitor across the room. It crashed against the wall, plastic shattering across the floor. The static cut off instantly. Silence. I stood there, panting, staring at the broken pieces scattered across the carpet. My chest heaved. For a moment, I thought it was over. And then, from the hallway just outside my door, I heard the creak of a single step, followed by another. Slow, heavy, getting closer. The steps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, staring at the broken pieces of the monitor scattered across the floor. The silence pressed in, louder than the steps themselves. I gripped the bat again, raising it like I was ready to swing at whatever came through the door. But the door didn't open. Instead, the air shifted. The temperature dropped so fast that my skin prickled with goosebumps. The kind of cold that sinks straight into your bones. Then came the sound. A whisper, not through the shattered monitor this time, but through the wood of the door itself. Daniel. I staggered back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The voice was wrong. It wasn't just outside the door. It was inside the walls, inside the air. Everywhere at once. The knob jiggled once, twice, then stilled. I couldn't take it anymore. I swung the bat hard, slamming it against the door. The crack echoed through the house like a gunshot. Silence. For a few long seconds, nothing moved. No sound, no whisper, no footsteps. Just me, standing there shaking, the bat raised in trembling hands. Finally, I backed away, forcing myself toward the bed. I slid down to the floor, pressing my back against the mattress, staring at the door until the first hint of dawn bled through the blinds. Only then did the heaviness lift. Only then did the house feel like a house again. The next morning, I wanted nothing more than to pack a bag and take my son far away. But where would we go? A hotel? My parents' place? How could I explain it without sounding insane? Instead, I moved through the day on autopilot. Coffee, breakfast, small talk, all while pretending everything was normal. But the silence in the house followed me everywhere. When my son played in the living room, I caught him glancing toward the hallway more than once. His eyes would fix on the nursery door before he quickly looked away. Finally, I asked, "What is it?" He hesitated, fiddling with his toy dinosaur. "I don't like that room." My throat tightened. "Why not?" He shrugged, eyes on the floor. "It doesn't like us." The words punched the air out of my chest. What do you mean? He shook his head quickly. Never mind. But the way he said it told me he wasn't making it up. By nightfall, I was unraveling. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. I double-checked the locks twice, then 3 times. I closed every window. I even slid the dresser in front of the nursery door. Still, I knew it wouldn't matter. When I tucked my son into bed, I stayed longer than usual, smoothing his blanket, brushing his hair back. He looked up at me, his eyes half-lidded with sleep, and whispered, "Don't let it in." I froze. But before I could ask what he meant, his breathing evened out. He was already asleep. I left his door open a crack and went to my room. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the chair by the window, bat across my lap, staring at the hallway. At 3 a.m., the shift came again. The house grew still, the air dense, the silence pressing in like a weight. And then, something new. From the nursery, behind the blocked door, came the sound of something dragging across the floor. Slow. Heavy. It moved from one side of the room to the other, scraping against the wood. I gripped the bat tighter, my hands slick with sweat. Then the sound stopped. The silence was unbearable, thick enough to choke on. And just when I thought it was over, a single knock echoed against the inside of the nursery door. Not random. Rhythmic. 3 sharp knocks. Like something wanted out. The 3 knocks still rang in my ears long after they faded. I sat frozen in the chair, the bat across my lap, my whole body trembling. Nothing moved. Nothing followed. But the silence that returned wasn't relief, it was worse. A silence that waited. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn touched the curtains. Only then did the pressure in the air ease. Only then did the house breathe again. That morning, I moved through the house like a stranger. I couldn't bring myself to go near the nursery. The dresser still stood pressed against the door, and I wasn't about to move it. But as I passed by in the hallway, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The edges of the doorframe, splintered, like the wood had been pushed from the inside. I forced myself to look away, clutching my son's small hand as we went downstairs. "Can we go to Grandpa's again?" he asked suddenly over breakfast. His voice was quiet, almost afraid. "Why?" I asked, even though I already knew. He didn't answer right away. He just picked at his cereal, eyes on the table. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Because it doesn't go there." The words sank into me like ice. I didn't argue. By mid-morning, we were in the car, driving across town. At my parents' house, the difference was immediate. The air was lighter. My son laughed freely again, chasing the dog through the yard. For the first time in days, I saw him relax. And me? I almost let myself believe it was over. Almost. But even as I smiled and made small talk with my parents, a part of me knew the truth. You can leave a house, but you can't leave what's already found you. We stayed the night. I slept in the guest room, my son curled up beside me. The soft hum of the old ceiling fan, the familiar smell of laundry detergent, should have lulled me into sleep. But at exactly 3 a.m., my eyes snapped open. The air was still. Too still. I sat up, scanning the shadows. The house was quiet. My son's breathing was steady beside me. And then I heard it. Not the monitor. Not static. A whisper. Right at my ear. "Daniel." I jerked upright, my heart slamming into my throat. There was no one there. Just empty air. The sound hadn't come from across the room. It hadn't even come from the hallway. It had come from inches away, as if someone had leaned down beside my bed. I clutched my son tighter, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. Nothing. Shadows, furniture, silence. I didn't sleep again. I just lay there, eyes wide, listening to every sound of the house. When morning came, I knew. It hadn't stayed in the nursery. It had followed me. Back at home the next day, I moved through the rooms with a new kind of dread. The house didn't just feel wrong, it felt claimed. Like it wasn't mine anymore. I tried to avoid the upstairs altogether, keeping us in the living room, the kitchen, the yard. But even there, I caught flashes of movement at the edges of my vision. A shadow where no shadow should be. A reflection in the TV screen that didn't match my own. My son saw it too. I could tell by the way he grew quieter, the way he clung closer, the way his eyes flicked to dark corners as though he expected something to crawl out of them. That night, I sat awake in the living room long after he'd gone to sleep. The house groaned around me. The silence thickened. And then, from upstairs, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of the monitor crackling back to life. Even though I had shattered it, even though it shouldn't exist anymore. And through the hiss came a whisper, curling down the stairs into the dark. "You can't hide from me, Daniel." The words slithered down the stairs, soft but undeniable. "You can't hide from me, Daniel." I gripped the armrest of the couch so hard the wood dug into my palm. The monitor was gone. I had shattered it. I had seen the plastic break, the wires spill out. There was no way it could be working. And yet, the hiss grew louder. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, frozen. My mind raced for an explanation. Anything rational. Anything that didn't mean what I already knew it meant. Finally, I forced myself to move. My legs trembled as I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became. The static filled the hallway, seeping out from behind the nursery door. I stopped outside it. The dresser I'd shoved against the door days ago was still there. No one had touched it. And yet, the sound bled through, stronger than ever. The voice followed. "Daniel." I stumbled back, while rising in my throat. It wasn't just speaking now, it was savoring my name, dragging it out like it belonged to it. I wanted to run, to grab my son, and drive until the house was nothing but a memory in the rearview mirror. But I couldn't move. My feet stayed rooted to the floor, locked in place by a terror that felt alive. And then, the monitor's hiss stopped. Silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It pulsed, thick and heavy, like something was crouched just on the other side of the wood. I forced myself back down the hallway, into my bedroom, shutting the door tight. I pressed my back against it, my chest heaving, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Not that night. The next morning, I tried to act normal. My son and I ate breakfast. I asked about his dreams, his cartoons, his toys. I tried to make my voice sound light, casual. But he wasn't fooled. "Dad?" he asked quietly. "Yeah. It talks to me too." I froze. "What does?" "The man." I swallowed hard. "What man?" He shrugged, his eyes on his cereal. "The one in the corner. He says your name a lot." My hand tightened around my coffee mug until I thought it would break. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. The way my son had said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. Like it was normal. Like he'd accepted that the man in the corner belonged here. I moved through the house like a shadow. I checked the nursery door again and again, making sure the dresser hadn't shifted. I caught myself staring at the walls, listening for sounds no one else could hear. By evening, my nerves were frayed raw. When I tucked my son in, I asked gently, "If you see him again, what does he look like?" My son thought for a moment, then shook his head. "You can't see his face." The words made my blood run cold. "Why not?" "Because he doesn't have one." He turned on his side then, pulling his blanket up, done with the conversation. But I stood there, paralyzed, staring at him in the soft glow of the night light, wondering what exactly had crept into our lives. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my room, staring at the hallway, listening. At 3 a.m., the shift came. The air thickened, pressing in like invisible hands. And then, from the other side of the nursery door, came a sound I hadn't heard before. Not static, not whispers. Knocking. Slow, measured, deliberate. 3 knocks, followed by silence. Then, 3 more, this time louder. And after the last one, the voice returned. "Daniel, open the door. Daniel, open the door." The words rattled through me, vibrating in my bones. I pressed my back tighter against the wall, clutching the bat until my hands ached. The knocks had stopped, but the air hadn't lightened. It was still thick, suffocating, every breath sharp like ice in my lungs. I stared at the nursery door from down the hall, the dresser still braced against it. It didn't move. The knob didn't turn, but the weight of something behind it was undeniable. It wanted me. And worse, it wanted me to let it in. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that silent war. Minutes? Hours. Eventually, the heaviness faded, replaced by the first faint gray of morning. When the sun came up, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. That day, I kept my son close. I didn't let him out of my sight. We stayed in the living room, cartoons blaring louder than usual, the sound filling every corner of the house. But even then, I caught him glancing toward the hallway again and again, his face pale, his small fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. Finally, I asked, "Do you see him right now?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Where?" His eyes flicked to the reflection in the black TV screen. "In there." I turned sharply. For a second, All I saw was our living room reflected back at me. Couch, curtains, bookshelf. But then I noticed it. A figure. Tall, thin, standing in the reflection of the hallway behind us. I spun around, nothing. The hall was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the reflection was gone. My son's hand slid into mine. His voice was small, almost trembling. He doesn't like when you see him. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my parents, asked if they could take my son for another night. They didn't ask many questions, they just said yes. When he was gone, the house felt worse. Empty, but not. I walked through the rooms in silence, checking locks, closing windows, making sure every light was on. But no amount of light could push back the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in. I found myself outside the nursery door again, staring at it like it held all the answers. The dresser sat firmly against it, but the wood around the frame looked worse, splintered deeper, as though something had been pressing harder from inside. My hand hovered over the knob. I told myself not to. I told myself to walk away. But some part of me, the part that needed proof, that needed to know, wouldn't let go. I pulled the dresser back, inch by inch, until the way was clear. The door creaked as I opened it. The nursery was dark, the curtains drawn tight. I flicked on the light. Everything looked normal. Toys in their bins. The crib made. Nothing out of place. Except, the broken baby monitor sat in the center of the floor. I staggered back. I had shattered it. I had thrown the pieces across my bedroom. But here it was again, whole. The green light glowed faintly. Static hissed into the silence. I should have run. I should have slammed the door and never looked back. But I couldn't move. My legs carried me forward, step by step, until I was standing over it. The hiss grew louder. And then, the voice. Thank you. My stomach lurched. For the first time, it wasn't calling my name. It wasn't commanding me. It was thanking me. And in the reflection of the crib's polished wood, I saw a movement. A shape, standing right behind me. I spun around, swinging the bat hard enough to split the air. But there was nothing there. Just the pale yellow walls, the crib, the shadows stretching long beneath the light. Still, I'd seen it. In the reflection, I'd seen a figure behind me. I staggered back, chest heaving, eyes darting from corner to corner. The static from the monitor rose, filling the nursery like a storm. And then came the laugh. Low, broken, drawn out through the speaker. It didn't sound like one voice. It sounded like dozens, layered together, mocking. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound drilled straight into my skull. Then silence. I dropped my hands, trembling. The green light blinked once, twice, then died. The monitor went dark. For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed, staring at it. My own breathing was the only sound in the room. Then, the closet door creaked. My stomach dropped. Slowly, my eyes shifted toward it. It stood slightly ajar, just enough to reveal the black gap inside. I had closed it that morning. I was sure of it. The bat felt slick in my grip as I forced myself closer. Every step made the boards groan, too loud in the heavy silence. I reached out and pushed the door shut with the tip of the bat. Click. Closed. I turned back toward the crib. The monitor was gone. The floor where it had sat was bare. I stumbled out of the nursery, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook so badly I could barely drag the dresser back in front of it. By the time I collapsed in my room, the sky outside had already begun to lighten. I lay in bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, afraid to blink, afraid to close my eyes. But exhaustion eventually won. When I woke hours later, the house felt different. Not lighter, not safer, but quieter. Too quiet. I forced myself through the motions of the day. Coffee, dishes, a shower that did nothing to wash the weight off me. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my mom. He's been asking for you. Wants to come home tonight. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to bring my son back into this. But I couldn't keep him away forever without raising suspicion. So I wrote back. I'll pick him up after dinner. The drive across town was uneventful, the late evening sun bleeding into the horizon. When I arrived, my son came running out the door, smiling wide, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. For a moment, just seeing him like that made everything else fade. But the second we stepped back into the house, his smile dropped. He stood in the entryway, staring up the stairs. What is it? I asked gently. He didn't look at me. It knows I'm back. The words chilled me. What does? His eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, I swear I saw something old in them. something that didn't belong to a child. The man with no face. That night, I tucked him into bed, trying to act normal. I read him a story, kissed his forehead, left the night light glowing. But I lingered in the doorway, watching his small chest rise and fall, listening to the silence that pressed in from the hallway. I knew what was coming. At 3 a.m., the shift came again. The air grew heavy. The silence deepened. And from my son's room, soft and clear, came the sound of his voice. Except it wasn't his. "Daniel, open the door." The sound froze me in place. It was my son's voice, high, small, unmistakable. But the way it spoke my name was wrong. Drawn out. Too slow. Too deliberate. "Daniel, open the door." I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and hurried down the hall. My son's door was closed. The soft glow of his nightlight spilled through the crack at the bottom. I gripped the handle. My hand trembled. From inside, his voice came again, only lower now, stretched, distorted. "Daniel." I shoved the door open. He was asleep, curled beneath his blanket, clutching his dinosaur, breathing evenly. His lips didn't move, but the voice hadn't stopped. It was still in the room. "Daniel." I turned toward the closet. The door was wide open. Inside was nothing but toys, shirts on hangers, a pair of shoes kicked to the side. But the dark inside that closet felt too deep, like it stretched further than the walls should allow. The voice seeped out of it, curling around me like smoke. "Let me out." I staggered backward, nearly tripping over the chair by his desk. My son stirred in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't make out, and for a terrible moment I thought he was answering. I slammed the closet door shut and yanked a chair in front of it. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped it. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed in his room the rest of the night, sitting in the chair by his bed with the bat across my lap. I didn't move until sunlight streamed through the window, cutting across the carpet. When my son woke, he rubbed his eyes, looked at me, and said, "You didn't let him out." My stomach lurched. "What?" He just shrugged and reached for his toy dinosaur, as if it wasn't strange at all. The day dragged. I couldn't focus on anything. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow caught my attention. By late afternoon, I felt raw, exhausted, hollowed out. And then the phone rang. I answered, grateful for the distraction. "Hello." Silence. Then static. My stomach dropped. The line hissed, crackled, then cleared just enough for a voice to seep through. "Daniel." I slammed the phone down so hard it rattled on the counter. My hands shook as I backed away. It wasn't just the monitor. It wasn't just the house. It could reach me anywhere. That night, I tried something different. I locked every door, every window. I shoved chairs beneath knobs, pushed furniture against frames. My son watched me quietly, his face pale but calm, like he'd already accepted what I couldn't. When I tucked him in, he whispered, "He's angry now." I knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. "Don't listen to him. Don't talk to him. He already knows you will," he said softly. The words sank into me like ice. At 3 a.m., the shift came. The house grew still. The air pressed down. I sat awake in my room, bat in hand, staring at the hallway. And then, from my son's room, came the sound of the closet door creaking open. Slow, drawn out. The chair I'd wedged against it scraped across the floor like it was being pushed aside. My son whimpered in his sleep. I ran, throwing his door open. The closet door stood wide. The toys, the shirts, the shoes, all gone. Just empty blackness yawning deep, too deep, stretching far beyond the dimensions of the house. And from that impossible dark, the voice called again. Not my son's voice this time. Deeper, hungrier. "Daniel, come inside." The words seeped out of the closet like cold air. "Daniel, come inside." I staggered back, pulling my son closer to me, though he was still half asleep, murmuring softly against my chest. His small hands clutched his toy dinosaur, but his body shivered like he could feel it too, that wrongness bleeding from the dark. The closet didn't look like a closet anymore. It stretched too far, the shadows rippling like water, swallowing the edges of the frame. It felt alive, like a mouth waiting to close around me. I slammed the door shut, shoved the chair back in front of it, and dragged my son into my room. We didn't sleep. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a trick of exhaustion. But the chair in front of the closet was split down the middle, cracked like something had forced its way through. And my son, he wouldn't go near his room. He clung to me all day, pale and silent, his eyes flicking toward the stairs as though he knew what was waiting above. I couldn't do it anymore. That evening, I packed a bag. Just essentials. Some clothes, my wallet, his favorite toy. We'd leave tonight, drive anywhere, sleep in the car if we had to. Anything to get away from the house. But when I opened the front door, I froze. The night outside was wrong. The streetlight at the end of the driveway flickered. The neighbors' houses stood dark, too dark, like shadows painted onto the world. The silence was suffocating, thicker than the air inside had ever been. And in that silence, I heard it. The same static hum. Not from a monitor. Not from a phone. From the trees. From the street. From everywhere at once. Daniel. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the bag. My son looked up at me, eyes wide but calm, and whispered, "He won't let us leave." That night, I barricaded the stairs. Chairs, the coffee table, anything I could drag across. It felt ridiculous, like a desperate act of denial. But I had to try. I kept my son in the living room, curled on the couch beside me, wrapped in blankets. The TV glowed silently, the only light besides the lamp. Midnight crawled past, then 1 o'clock, then 2, and at 3, it came again. The shift. The silence pressed in, crushing. The static hummed through the walls, through the floor, through the very air. Then the footsteps began. Slow, steady, descending the stairs. The barricade groaned under their weight. I grabbed the bat, my hands slick, my heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, just on the other side of the barricade. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from directly behind the furniture, came the voice. "Daniel, let me in." My son whimpered, burying his face against my side. I stood frozen, every muscle taut, waiting for the crash, the break, the moment the barricade would splinter and something faceless would step into the room. But it never came. Instead, the voice whispered softer. "You've already opened the door." And from the corner of the living room, the corner where no door should exist, came a sound like hinges creaking. I turned slowly, my blood turning to ice. The wall was opening. Not splitting, not breaking, opening. A doorway yawning into blackness, deep and endless, the same impossible dark I'd seen in the closet. And in the reflection of the TV screen, I saw a tall figure step through. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I just stared at the TV screen, the faint glow flickering against the glass. And in that reflection, the figure stood. Tall, thin. Its body seemed to flicker at the edges, as though it wasn't fully solid. Its face, or where a face should have been, was smooth and blank, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. My son whimpered beside me, clutching his dinosaur so tightly I thought the seams would rip. The figure stepped forward. In the reflection, its movements were jerky, wrong, like a film reel missing frames. But the sound of its steps was steady, slow, deliberate, heavy enough that the floor groaned beneath it. I tightened my grip on the bat. My arms felt like lead. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The barricaded stairs, the sealed doors, the yawning black opening in the wall. We were trapped. "Don't look at him," my son whispered. His voice was trembling, but sure. "That's what he wants." I tore my eyes from the reflection and stared instead at my son's pale face. His small hands shook, but his gaze stayed fixed on the floor. The figure stopped. Silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I could feel its presence looming over us, heavy and cold. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. And then it spoke. Not through the monitor this time. Not through static. Through the air itself. "Daniel." The sound filled the room, vibrating in my chest, echoing in my skull. My son whimpered again. I raised the bat. My voice broke as I whispered, "Stay away from us." The figure tilted its head in the reflection, like it was curious. Then, it laughed. The sound was wrong. Not a single laugh, but dozens, layered together, rising and falling in a jagged chorus. It made the walls vibrate, made the floor shudder beneath us. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't let go of the bat. The laughter stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, the figure moved again. Closer. Its steps shook the room, though in the reflection it seemed to glide, jerking forward in unnatural bursts. My son's grip on me tightened until his nails dug into my arm. "Dad," he whispered. "He's not here for me." The words made my blood run cold. The figure stopped again, and this time, It spoke with clarity, every syllable sharp and deliberate. "Daniel, you let me in." I staggered back, dragging my son with me. My voice cracked as I shouted, "Stay away." The figure raised one hand in the reflection, long and skeletal, the fingers twitching like they were testing the air. And then, without touching anything, the barricade across the stairs shattered. The chairs, the table, splintered like twigs, flying apart with a crash that shook the house. The figure turned its blank face toward the staircase. The doorway in the wall yawned wider, pulling at the air, the shadows writhing inside it. I realized then it hadn't come for my son. It had come for me. I pulled him tighter, stumbling backward toward the kitchen. The bat felt useless in my hand, but I couldn't drop it. The figure turned back toward us, and for the first time, I couldn't resist. I looked directly at it, and in that faceless void, I saw something shift. Not eyes, not a mouth, something worse. Something that knew me. Something that had always known me. And in a voice that was no longer a whisper, but a roar that shook the walls, it said, "Daniel, it's time. Daniel, it's time." The sound shook the air, rattled the walls, pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. My son screamed, burying his face against me, but I couldn't move. My legs felt nailed to the floor. The figure stepped closer. Each movement was jerky in the reflection, smooth in the room. It stretched its long fingers toward me. The doorway in the wall gaped wider. The blackness inside churned like water, pulling at the air, tugging the lamp's weak light toward it. I stumbled back, clutching my son with one arm, the bat raised uselessly in the other. "Stay away," I shouted, though my voice cracked and broke. The figure didn't stop. My son's small voice cut through the air, "Don't look at him, Dad." But I already had, and I couldn't look away. The blank face held me. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with everything I feared, every secret I'd ever buried, every shadow that had followed me in the dark. It wasn't just watching me. It knew me. I swung the bat with everything I had, screaming, desperate. The wood passed through the figure like smoke. The force of the swing spun me off balance, sending me crashing into the coffee table. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned closer. And this time, when it spoke, it wasn't just one voice. It was mine. "Daniel, come home." The pull of the black doorway grew stronger, dragging at my clothes, my skin, my very breath. The walls groaned. The TV toppled from its stand, shattering on the floor. I clutched my son tighter, fighting against the pull. My feet slid across the carpet. "Hold on to me," I shouted. He clung to me, sobbing. "Don't go, Dad." The figure stood at the edge of the darkness, one hand extended. Behind me, the front door slammed open, though no one had touched it. Cold night air rushed in. For a split second, I thought maybe we had a chance, maybe we could run. But the pull grew stronger. The shadows wrapped around my ankles like hands, dragging me inch by inch toward the open maw in the wall. I fought, every muscle straining, the bat slipping from my grasp. I screamed, clawed at the floor, clutching my son with everything I had. "Let him go," I warned. "Take me, just let him go." The figure paused. For a heartbeat, the pull eased. Then it tilted its head, as if considering. And in my son's small, trembling voice, it whispered back, "Okay." The shadows surged. I felt myself ripped from the floor, my son torn from my arms. I screamed his name, reaching for him, but the black swallowed me whole. Cold, endless, a void that stretched forever, filled with whispers that were all my own voice, echoing in the dark. "Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." I reached out, desperate, but there was nothing to grab, nothing solid to hold. Just endless falling, endless noise. And then, silence. I woke to sunlight. The living room was quiet. The furniture was intact. The wall where the doorway had opened stood solid again, unbroken. My son sat on the couch, clutching his dinosaur, staring at me with wide eyes. "Dad," he whispered. My voice cracked. "I'm here." He didn't move, didn't smile, just stared. And then, slowly, he tilted his head, exactly like the figure had. The air in the room grew colder. And in a voice that wasn't his, my son whispered, "Thank you for letting me in."